As a child, Stuart Broad dreamt of becoming a professional cricketer. Now, for the first time, he is sharing the story of how he made that dream a reality. From the big showdowns and moments to the relationships and rivalries, to the seam and to the swing, and to his last ever Ashes this summer, Stuart takes you beyond the boundary and into his life and career on and off the pitch. This is a memoir that will bowl you over. Broadly speaking, Stuart Broad's autobiography is now out in hardback, ebook and audio. Head to the link in the description to order your copy now. Hello and welcome to the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast. The 2023 World Cup group stage is finally over. Well done for getting through it with us. All that is left is a trio of mouth-watering knockout games. India versus New Zealand at the Wankhede, Australia against South Africa at Eden Gardens. This time next week, we will know the identity of the 2023 world champions. Elsewhere, England have named a couple of squads for their tour of the West Indies. There's a squad for the women's test in India next month. The great Meg Lanning has announced her retirement from international cricket at the age of 31. Sri Lanka have been suspended from the ICC, and Katya has spent some time talking to a member of the Afghanistan women's team to tell you about what's going on over there. A potential monster of a show. I'm Yas Rana, and with me today is Jo Harman, Phil Walker and Katya Witney. Mott Buttler will be joining us later in the show. Right, let's start with those semi-finals. India versus New Zealand, Australia versus South Africa. Joe, do New Zealand have a chance?
God, I wish I could say yes. I think for them to stand a genuine chance, they need to win the toss and bat first. We've seen at the Wankhede so far in the tournament that teams chasing have really struggled under lights. The ball's done quite a bit, swing and seam for their first 10, 15 overs. So I think New Zealand's best chance is to bat first, get a score on the board and put really big early pressure on that Indian top order. But Matt Henry's a big loss. That bowling attack doesn't look as strong as it did at the start of the tournament. And they also only have the 4 specialist bowlers. Glenn Phillips and Ravindra have done really good job, surprisingly so. But I think India will really go after those two. And then they haven't really got anywhere else to go. Southee has gone, I think, about 7 and over in the tournament so far. And New Zealand won one of the last 5 games. India have won 9 on the bounce. There was a stat that I saw. India have lost the last 4 knockout matches against New Zealand across formats. So that's something. I hope I'm wrong, but I can't see it really.
Yeah, it's been an uneventful campaign for New Zealand, really. Like, they comfortably beat the teams that finished in the bottom half. And then, other than the South Africa game, never lost by that much against the sides that finished in the top half. But I guess, Phil, in 2019, they got to the semi-finals without having beaten anyone in the top half yet. Obviously, did a number on India in the semi-final.
Over 2 days. That was the 2-day game, wasn't it?
The 2-day, 1-dayer.
Yeah, puncher's chance. No more than that. Much hinges on Ravindra, the star of the whole tournament. And as Joe says, the toss is absolutely essential. You brought it up for us earlier in our pre-show notes, which sometimes we even actually have. 399, 382, 357, 3 of the 4 scores batting first at the Wankhede.
And I think it's an average of 188 when chasing, and that's including Glenn Maxwell's double ton against England. So it's not been an easy ground at all to chase.
Do you think?
And again, I guess if it is going to be another absolute scorchio, as say it was with the England South Africa game, then the toss becomes ever more important.
Do you think it is at all significant that India have basically been assured of their place in the semis for weeks, whereas the other side's about to scrap a little bit more? South Africa and Australia each had an epic win of their own. New Zealand, their qualification wasn't that smooth in the end. I mean, the India-Netherlands game yesterday was like an exhibition game, whereas the other sides have been playing World Cup cricket right until the end.
Yeah, I don't think that really makes much odds on the day, but where if you are in the New Zealand camp, you're going to be feeling chipper is that in the end, it always comes down to knockout games, right? However newfangled or old-fangled the tournament structure is, in the end, it comes down to the day. The toss will be important. And a bit of luck, right? Clearly player for player, India are just a marvellous cricket team, the perfect cricket team. They're also, by the way, everyone's in form as well. And how rare is that? Even with a winning team, everyone's in form and everyone's had a hit as well. So even their middle order, which in previous tournaments
That was
has
an
not
issue
had
in 2019, wasn't it?
Exactly 4 years ago. You know, numbers 4 and 5 made hundreds the other day. Everyone's made runs. Everyone's made big runs. Gill is the only one who's maybe had a quietish tournament. Obviously, he was injured initially, but even he came into form the other day as well. So everything is playing perfectly for India. But, you know, it's a white ball 50-over knockout game, so anything can happen.
And it is a rarity for a team to go through a whole World Cup without losing a game. I think Australia were the last team to do it in 2007. And obviously, this is a huge World Cup. So it is a big ask to go through 6.5 weeks without having a blip. But I think this Indian side is so good that I suspect they probably won't have one.
Katya, in the second semi-final, both Australia and South Africa have played 9, won 7, lost 2, got there in slightly different ways. How much of a chance are you giving South Africa not only in that game, but also over the course of the whole week?
I think South Africa have been the most interesting team to follow in this competition because they're so boom or not quite bust, but when they get it right, they really get it right. And when they get it wrong, they look pretty average. So if they get it right, they can beat Australia and there's no reason to suggest that they can't beat India. But if you take out Australia for a minute and you just look at India, the mental clarity that India have around what they're doing and how they're playing their cricket as a side is such a huge difference to South Africa because South Africa have got this monkey on their back about chasing and whether they can continue that style that they play when they're setting, when they chase. So while South Africa have every chance of beating both Australia and India, equally that, you know, they could be rubbish. So we'll have to wait and see. But South Africa in knockouts haven't historically gone well. And maybe they'll be able to change it around, maybe they won't, but it's hard to look past India, I guess. And Australia have been, having started the tournament pretty quietly, they've been pretty clinical in the last few weeks. So it's that kind of clarity thing again. So we'll have to wait and see. But South Africa are the uncertain, whereas I think India and Australia are the more kind of certain teams to back going through.
I always wonder, how much do we put too much on history? Like, are South Africa going to be a bit worse because Lance Klusener and Alan Donald mangled a quick single 24 years ago?
But the fact it gets talked about so much, and we have heard more recent players talk about that. I think it, you know, you shouldn't overestimate it, but I think it is a thing. I think what's in favour for South Africa this time is, I think we all said at the start, we didn't really know what they were going to be like, but I think we can say they've exceeded expectations. So this time there isn't, you know, if they lose, they haven't choked, unless they get into a position where they should definitely win and then they don't. But all the pointers are suggesting that Australia will win this game. They've won 7 in a row now. South Africa got thrashed by India, a little bit unconvincing against Afghanistan. But I maybe this is just wishful thinking, but I do quite fancy South Africa to win this one. I think their bowling attack is good enough to create real problems for Australia, take top order wickets early doors, and then I'm not convinced by that Australian middle order still. I know I've been saying it all the way through, and I wasn't sure about Maxwell at number 5, although in fairness he did get that double time from number 6, so
But no,
he played well. I'll give him that. He played well.
I think it's fair enough. Their middle order hasn't really come together in the same way that the other semi-final middle orders have against the better teams in the competition. I think that's completely fair. I mean, they were also 91 for 7 in the game that Maxwell got his double 100. On the world's biggest stage, there is no hiding place. To some, it is a blur. To others, everything comes into sharp focus. This is the time to seize the moment, paying attention to every detail. What looks effortless is actually born out of diligence, both in sport and in life. This is the time to step up to the plate. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. Congratulations to Mitch Marsh, who has won this week's Charles Tyrrett Cometh the Hour Moment of the Week for his 177 not out against Bangladesh. Jo, there's a selection dilemma for Australia in that they've never actually had all their batters fit at one point. So Marnus Labuschagne has played all 9 games, but might not actually be in their best team. What do you think they're going to do, given that they should have everyone available for that semi-final?
My assumption was that Labuschagne would miss out. Steve Smith hasn't made a hugely compelling case, but did get some runs against Bangladesh. And I just think World Cup semi-final, you probably go to Steve Smith. And Labuschagne's done all right, a little bit harsh, but you know he wasn't even going to be in the squad not so long ago. He's done a fine job, but I think he'll make way. I think that suits the balance of that batting unit best.
I guess there's an option to also drop Stoinis potentially, and I know that people are saying that Labuschagne's also had a significant impact in the field as well, but I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion. Does anyone else have a strong opinion?
Well, I think it'd be harsh to drop Marsh after he's smashed 170 odd not out.
Definitely harsh to drop Marsh.
Yeah, the Stoinis one possibly makes sense more than Labuschagne because, if South Africa have got a shit hot seam attack, then they might want that solidity in the middle, either side of a bunch of hitters. Obviously Smith isn't, but the two openers are. Marsh is at 3 and Maxwell's a freak. So it might make sense perhaps to go with Labuschagne. I have to say I haven't considered it in great depth. So I'm rather landing upon that one. I tipped
got enough bits and pieces batters who bowl a bit, haven't they, to not have Stoinis on that side. They could make up the overs elsewhere.
Yeah,
so it is a genuine option.
Yeah, and Travis Head's bowled a bit of off spin quite usefully since he's come back into the side as well. I tipped Australia to win it at the start. I actually, if there's going to be an upset in these two games, upset in inverted commas because it's not really, but everyone assumes that it's an India-Australia final, and people are quite resigned to it. We keep getting WhatsApp messages, especially from people who are out there, really in the pressure cooker of it, and they're saying, "Oh, well, it's obviously inevitable. It'll be an India-Australia final on Sunday. The rest is just detail." But I think that there's definite potential that something can go awry from that obvious narrative. It's very rare that the linear story just never really deviates, right? And I can see of the two, I don't see New Zealand really getting anything out of that game. I just think the momentum for India is such, and their confidence is through the roof. But yeah, I can see South Africa turning over Australia. Definitely. I can see that.
At this stage, presumably there's no realistic chance that Bavuma will make way, but it does feel like they would be a better batting unit at the moment with Reza Hendricks up top. I mean, he batted beautifully against England. Bavuma's made a couple of 20s and 30s, but I guess at this stage you can't shift your captain. That would be
a big call at this point in time.
It would but aside from the fact that Markram has captained them very well when he's had an opportunity as well, it wouldn't be tearing the whole thing up at this stage. Bavuma hasn't played every game, but yeah, probably not one for now. And I do feel sorry for Bavuma because it feels like every major tournament we get to, he's having not only his captaincy but his place in the side questioned, and he obviously leads the team well.
Yeah, look, 100% agree with that. Of all the scenarios across the 200 overs across those 2 days, just let Bavuma get 50 and 35, 40 balls, please, because it's this perpetual story around him, and it's not fair because his record is very good, but the fates seem to conspire against him, and now, legitimately, you raise that question. Telv Advice, very good South African writer, wrote about this on, I think, on Crick Buzzer. It might be on his blog, but the curious case of Temba Bavuma's selection. But his record coming into the tournament,
absolutely flying coming into.
Yeah, and also Reza Hendricks wasn't his ODI record is inferior to Bavuma's, but form wise,
but obviously, completely
fair question.
Yeah, the mark he made against England, that 80 odd and 60 odd balls, spoke for itself. But Bavuma he's not a stooge, right? He's a fine player, and it would be great if he just gets a few. So at least whatever happens in the fullness of that game, nobody can, after the event, say, well, hold on, it was another compromised selection, in massive air quotes.
I think it's been a bit of a weird tournament for Bavuma, right, though, because he's not been able to build up much momentum because he's kind of been a bit in and out of the side. And when you look at that South Africa batting lineup, everyone is such a different player to him. So when you look at Quinton de Kock scoring his 18th 100 in 10 games or something, that's not Bavuma, and it contrasts so much. And then you've got Klaasen and you've got Miller in the middle order that are so different to Bavuma. And with Rassie van der Dussen, who's probably the most similar player, you'd have to say, to Bavuma in that lineup, he's been in such good form that it's kind of eclipsed Bavuma again. So I think there's a tendency to be quite harsh, as you guys have acknowledged, on Bavuma. And on the Reza Hendricks point, tournaments aren't just won by 11 players. You've got to have those batters to come in and be in form straight away when you've got that. Those niggles in the first 11. If you look at England in 2019, when Jason Roy got injured, that was where it nearly all went awry, right? Because they didn't have those players to come in and be in that form when Jason Roy wasn't available. So I think it's really harsh on Temba Bavuma to kind of question like what his tournament has amounted to midway through. But yeah, we'll wait and see.
Let's hear from Mott Butcher on the semi-finals and then those England squads for the West Indies. No cricket today, but 2 semi-finals later in the week. India, New Zealand on Wednesday, Australia, South Africa in Calcutta on Thursday. India, obviously massive favourites for the first semi-final. That second one's slightly harder to call though. When the two teams played against each other early in the tournament, South Africa were dominant, but Australia have gone on a really good run since then. How do you see that game going?
Well, I think both teams will be very keen to have a bat first, won't they? Particularly given that Kolkata has been perhaps one of the more difficult and the more tricky surfaces over the course of the World Cup. Slow, low, the ball has bitten quite a bit, and also that transition period under lights for the second innings, the ball seems to have hooped and done all sorts for the seamers as well. So toss could be very significant there. Well, Australia, I think, will go into it very incredibly confident. I mean, obviously, I think they've won 7 on the bounce now, haven't they? And everything seems to have fallen in place for them, having got off to the sort of start that England got off to, but weren't able to arrest that slide. Australia just have got stronger as things have gone along, with Adam Zampa being the sort of like the ace in the hole for them. Nobody would have picked that, I don't think, before the whole thing started. So, and I think Australia also, the weight of history and all of the other things that they can call upon to kind of to stifle and to upset and to sort of to give South Africa the jitters are all there aplenty. Going back to obviously '99, going back to various other huge clashes between these two teams, Australia seemed to come out on top. So I think given a fair wind and given that the coin comes down the right way for them, that they will feel that they're very much in it. But they will be quite rightly worried about and afraid of what South Africa might be able to do to them should the coin come down their way and they get to bat first too. So it's a titanic tussle. I edge towards Australia in these knockout games for sure.
England obviously hoped that muscle memory would sort of power them at the start of the tournament, having not played that much ODI cricket before, but it does seem that Australia's sort of collective memory of just winning things has helped them quite a lot in this tournament. How much of a difference can that make for a cricket side? Because you've got a lot of players in this side who've won the 2015 World Cup, the 2021 T20 World Cup, and the World Test Championship early in the year. A lot of all format World Cup winners in this side. Yeah,
winning is certainly a habit that in the same way that losing is, that breeds confidence. I also think that what they've done incredibly well is that they've kind of been able to cope with injuries, with comings and goings in the squads, and replaced like for like people. Haven't messed around too much with the balance of the team. Sort of losing Glenn Maxwell to that freak accident, Mitch Marsh having to disappear for a while. Marnus Labuschagne has kind of been the beneficiary of all of these comings and goings, but fundamentally they've still remained pretty much the same balance of their side, and that's helped them out big time. And batters, top order batters making runs on a regular basis. Your man Davey Warner hasn't disappointed.
I seem to remember you used the word insane when I said he might be the lead on score.
I said really, yeah. But I mean, still he's done exactly what you suggested he might, which is he's a serial run scorer in India, and has played in such a way where he hasn't been so high risk that he's given himself no chance of getting in. And Australia and South Africa have both played the conditions exceptionally well when it comes to building totals. So top order players scoring big runs, and then your maniacs going mad at the back end, with the obvious exception of Glenn Maxwell and his particular brand of madness in the Afghanistan game.
Such is the way that international cricket works, and particularly England's international schedule. They announced a squad for the West Indies tour next month, I think fewer than 12 hours after their final World Cup game against Pakistan. There are 9 changes from the squad that went to India, which sounds like a lot. It's a big headline figure, but given the age profile of the 2023 World Cup squad, that isn't a huge surprise. And arguably, actually, there isn't as much change as it could have been. Mott and Buttler are still in place. Two of the most underperforming players at the World Cup in Livingston and Curran are still there. There are a few other notable exclusions. Sam Hain, who was in the squad for the Ireland series, he's not there. What did you make of that 15-man squad?
It was pretty much as I imagined it to be. Actually, that the older, more experienced, the 2019 sort of World Cup winners all sat it out, with the exception of Joss. And the rest of it is built around the sort of an access of Buttler, Brooke, Sam Curran, Liam Livingston as the sort of your more experienced players, and then the sort of the wealth of those very talented guys coming up behind in the batting department. Obviously, Ben Duckett champing at the bit for a chance. Salt, Jacks, Rayan Ahmed gets an opportunity to sit in and be that middle overs leg break wicket taker in place of Adil Rashid. So all of these things are as expected. Really good to see John Turner and Josh Tongue get the shout in the quick bowling department as well. And Bryden Cast, as we expected, will also be a major part of that as well. So there aren't that many surprises, to be honest with you. And I pretty much was sure that Buttler and Mott would remain in post for two reasons, really. The first one being that, as I've mentioned before, I think that Mott perhaps deserves the opportunity to try and build something of his own, having sort of taken over, the back end of the Morgan era and rather inherited a lot of the squad. And there is no outstanding candidate, I suppose, to replace Josh Buttler right at this very minute in time, when they're trying to figure out who the main players might be going forward. So no surprises that with the turnaround coming so quickly that there are no changes there at all. And I think it's a really great opportunity for some of these guys. Some of these guys have played so little 50-over cricket that the Sam Hain argument becomes one that I'm sure fans of the Bears and those who like to throw barbs at Surrey County Cricket Club, there aren't many people like that, are there? Will be like, well, Sam Hain has this incredible record as a 50-over player. In his one ODI appearance, has made a pretty good 80 against Ireland. And suddenly is discarded before he's had the chance to perhaps get his feet under the table for a player in Ollie Pope, who's hardly played any 50-over cricket at all, and hasn't picked up a bat since whatever it was, the second Test match of the Ashes series. So there is certainly a question to be had around that decision and what that means for the way that England see Sam Hain or don't see Sam Hain as getting involved in this one-day international setup between now and the World Cup. But beyond that, the rest of it is pretty much as you'd expect, I think.
I guess it was notable that Dawid Malan was not included in the T20 group. He, I suppose, is dropped for his T20 form in the summer. But I find it interesting that he's almost in exactly the same position as David Willey was, in that neither was that likely, no matter how they went in the World Cup, to play more 50-over cricket after the World Cup, given their ages. And there's been no T20 played since Malan was given the contract. So I don't know what's changed from then to now. It does just feel like that the contracts is just going to be something that lingers around all squad announcements for quite a long time, because as exciting as the bowling group is for both squads, the ODI and T20, they have given multi-year contracts to players who haven't played that much for England. Bryden Cast, Josh Tongue and Gus Atkinson have played 25 games across all formats and have 6 years worth of contracts between them. John Turner has barely played for Hampshire, yet he's got a development contract. These are really exciting players, but given the depth of investment, I guess, in them, it might mean that England have some tricky decisions to make down the line because of that investment.
Yeah, well, that is always the case, isn't it? And you have to temper the reasoning behind giving the contracts in the first place with the actual practicality of what that means in terms of selection going forward. And there's a little bit of gambling going on. I know Kesey's quite a man for a punt, and he'll stick his neck out on decisions made around players that he thinks, along with management, that will be the guys to back for the future. And I kind of back him for that. Because you have to. There's no way of you have to identify the sort of talents that you might want and that might be useful to you in the future, and you have to give them as much possible chance to develop as you possibly can. And every once in a while, you make a punt like that, and it goes sour on you. But generally speaking, I think England have been pretty good at identifying people that have the goods to succeed in Test match cricket going forward. As I said, there's only Sam Hain is probably the only one admitted. As well as Matthew Potts, funnily enough, who you could kind of say, well, that's perhaps a point of contention. The rest, I think, you'd pretty much say is spot on. It's interesting that Mr. Hartley gets another chance, perhaps, to play one-day international cricket after getting his cap at Trent Bridge against Ireland. Tom Hartley. Of course, that the way has been paved open for him by somebody like Liam Dawson packing the whole thing in. Remember him, Liam Dawson? So, you know, there are one or two, I suppose you could sort of say, well, you know, perhaps you could have gone this way or that way. But I think it looks like a solid squad. And I suppose on the T20 side of things, you know, Moeen remains. Tamar Mills is back in, which means that Tongue and Turner are both in there, aren't they? I was just trying to think. Cast is ODI only, so Cast steps aside for the T20s. Topley, Mills, and Wokes come back in for that, and Adil Rashid maintains his spot. And again, you know, looking to the T20 World Cup, there will be a lot of players who have just recently come back disappointed from the World Cup, who will find themselves back in the defence of that title in the T20. And so good to have a thread of continuity. A thread of continuity for Jos Buttler in the West Indies, where of course they play 5 matches in the T20 format, with guys that he will be taking forward or hoping to take forward into that World Cup.
Well, the grind never stops. 8 more limited overs games for England before Christmas. Cheers for your time, Butch. Catch you on the dailies for the semi-finals.
Will do.
So yeah, England have named a set of squads for that tour to West Indies next month, where they'll play 3 ODIs and 5 T20s. Those series obviously fulfilling vastly contrasting functions. Joe, Tom asked, is John Turner a slight win for the Royal London One Day Cup? Played 2 full seasons in the competition, allowing him exposure when Hampshire were not at full strength, and if they were at full strength, he might not have got that opportunity.
Absolutely, great shout, definitely.
A reminder that Turner is 22, has a development contract with England, was called up for the New Zealand series in September, but then missed out through injuries. Played just 30 professional games across all formats and has been clocked at 90 miles per hour and has in effect been fast-tracked on potential.
Were you on that Surrey game when Hampshire came here on the Sunday afternoon and he was outstanding?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. It's the only time I've seen him live. Literally never heard the name before. Obviously, I was doing my research diligently in the build-up to that one. And he opened the bowling. He bowled 2 and 2 either side, and he was cut above. Excellent. You can totally understand immediately why they're interested in him. He's got height and pace and accuracy.
And he's one of those selections that's sort of based on the rise of analytics in county cricket, I guess, that they have the technology to confidently clock players at 90 miles per hour when they perhaps wouldn't have been able to do that a few years ago.
Can we just briefly go back to the World Cup, Yas? I'm just looking at the top run scorers and your spectacular David Warner shout. So at the start of the tournament, the Butcher, spat his coffee out all over his laptop.
The word he used was insane.
Insane, yeah, okay. So 499 runs for Davey. He's currently number 5 in the list, but he will need a big two games, won't he? He'll need a big 2 games. So Virat is clear by 3 runs from de Kock. And in our in-work sweepstake, that means Joey P, our dandy designer, who barely leaves the house, let alone lifts a finger, he is in line as it stands. He's got Kohli. Katya, you had Markram, didn't you?
Yeah, I was sitting pretty at the end of the first week because I've got Markram and KRL. I was very happy about that.
Yeah, fallen away. Both fallen away quite badly, really. And Ravindra, of course, is Office Junior Barney, isn't it? Barney Hope, who's become a sort of cult hero of the podcast in recent weeks. But he's got the cock. So
he's got Ravindra.
Sorry, he's got Ravindra. Yeah. And who's got the cock? Who's got the cock? Here we go. This is all good content. Melinda Farrell, who's been out there for 6 weeks now, riding her thumb. She's got a pass in the press box for the semi-final as well. So she's got Quinton de Kock as well. So everything to play for. And you've got Jos Buttler.
And I think I replied with, I think I'm going to win this one when I saw my...
I can't even remember who I've got, which I've lost something
interest,
about.
To be fair, no one was interested anyway, and yet I still went ahead and did it. It's one of my biggest professional regrets, really.
So there's a video of you doing it that's yet to see the light of day.
Yeah, and thankfully never will. Not my finest work. Anyway, we move on. Yeah, I had Stokes. That went well. And Big Frank Karunaratne. Lovely stuff.
Anyway, back to the squads for the West Indies.
All right, mate.
Katya, there is no Milan in either squad. In isolation, neither omission is scandalous. He'll be 40 by the time the next ODI World Cup takes place, and very few players from that World Cup squad over the age of 30 are included. And in the T20 side, he was dropped from the Trent Rockets in the 100. But he also weirdly had a good good World Cup since the last time England played a T20. He was also given a central contract again since the last time England played a T20. So not for the first time Milan is dropped, having recently done quite well. What did you make of that call?
Yeah, well, like you said, it's not scandalous, but it makes me sad. Yeah, I mean, it just feels a bit strange to have your best batter in the World Cup be then the kind of headline that's dropped, like for the next series and for the T20 stuff. You can see the logic behind it in that he was kind of dropped through the last T20 World Cup, and like you said, he's not gonna be part of the next ODI World Cup through age. But the weird bit there is the central contract, because surely those decisions were made even if they weren't communicated to Milan or the public or whoever, those would have been pre-tournament decisions. So to give him a central contract in amongst that stance just feels very odd, I guess.
It's very confusing because what did they think was going to happen?
Yeah.
So even if England had won the World Cup, were they going to continue with Milan for the next 2 years? Probably not. Now they've bummed out and he's actually been one of the best players. And obviously there is logic in not continuing giving a contract, but it just doesn't make any sense. I can't see where he thought this is the scenario where actually it's going to be good to have Milan contracted for 2 more years.
Yeah, it's kind of like a puppy that keeps getting kicked, to be honest. He just looks kind of sad.
I said it to you the other day, didn't I? Through no fault of his own, he seems to be he resonates with England failure.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely unfair. It's just a rank quirk of fate, that he happens to be scoring runs as the only one on a disastrous Ashes tour. He's the one who injures himself when England go and win the T20 World Cup when he's gone in there as number 1 player in the world. He's the one who carries the can for this when he's been England's best player.
But then they're also stringing him along, so it's kind of like, you're keeping him with you, but you constantly kick him away, but you keep bringing him back to try and worsen the pain. It just doesn't seem particularly fair to keep.
And that's why that's the only way I can see why they did give him a contract was because they didn't want to tell him on the eve of the World Cup that he wasn't going to play after it in the way that they did with David Willey. David Willey was probably expected to be a fringe player. Milan was going to be opening the batting in a World Cup. And they probably felt like they needed to show some faith in him. But if that faith is 2 years of a contract that he's not even going to play for, then that is mad.
But what's kinder, telling a player midway through the World Cup that they're not going to be part of your plans going forward, or stringing someone along even though it's obvious that they're not going to be part of your plans going forward?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I just think it is quite weird in that I think the whole I think we're going to be talking about these central contracts for literally years, given how long the length of these contracts are. And I think it will affect selection, and we will judge selection by it. We'll judge selection when someone is given a contract. Is a call up for a squad when they have a contract and perhaps don't deserve to. And yeah, I mean, there was no T20 cricket played between the last time England played and the contract's been given out. I would have understood it if he was part of the T20 squad and part of the group for the World Cup.
Might have played the World Cup, yeah.
Yeah. I just don't really know what's changed since they last played.
Yeah. I would have also understood it if he hadn't made any runs.
Yeah.
Because, players have to be... selectors have to be able to drop players irrespective of whether they're on 1 year, 2 years or 3 years. So that's okay, I think. These contracts are an attempt to try and retain ownership of these players' movements. And it's a last dying wheeze in that fight, by the way, but that's another story. What is back to front about this is that he has gone well. He's fit, he's motivated, he said he is, and he's played better than all the other players out there overall. And obviously his T20 record is outstanding. So it is bizarre. It's utterly weird. And if it was a case that you were giving contracts to everybody, irrespective really of how they went, everyone in the setup, then the David Willey story blows that idea out of the water as well. So it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. Yeah,
they basically made a decision on his T20 career based on a good 50-over World Cup, but nothing other than that has happened. Phil, what have you made of the round of interviews Rob Key's done since the squads were announced? He's, on the one hand, held his hands up and said it was him who deprived Mott and Buttler of their best players for the entirety of the build-up to the 50-over World Cup. But he's also been very honest about the mistakes that Buttler and Mott made in India. obviously a lot of the focus on the toss decisions. England won 7 out of 9 tosses. They lost on all 4 occasions. They chose to bowl first. I get that he thinks that Mott and Buttler haven't been given a fair chance, but he's also been pretty critical and very, admirably honest actually about their in-tour management. What have you made of that?
It was a great relief to hear somebody actually speak in coherent sentences for the first time in weeks. Anyone attached to English cricket at the top level, English men's cricket, and so that was quite a balm, if you like. And he is liberated by not defining himself by this job, to be honest. When he came into it, he said, look, I'll see how it goes. I've got some ideas. Didn't expect to get this. Didn't expect to run for it. But I've got some ideas, and let's see how they play out. And, after a couple of years, we'll have a look at it. And that's essentially his message. So he brought that kind of common sense, straightforwardness to the role. But crucially, he doesn't define himself by it, so he can actually call it as he sees it. And he's a natural communicator, which is what made him so good on the telly, what made him a very good captain for 15, 20 years. And so the stuff that he said, I thought was refreshingly fair and good. I thought the word he used, overthought, we overthought our tactical decisions, was absolutely bang on. And I think there are many, many theories around what's happened here, and there's murmurs of disquiet in the camp. Morgan spoke about that. There's certainly the broader existential crisis that hangs heavy over English men's cricket, as we were talking about just a minute ago. And Key acknowledges that himself, right? He references that himself and has done a number of times. And his justification, for example, for the contracts is, well, we need to hold on to these by their coattails for as long as we possibly can. The biggest story in all of this is that Stokes is offered a 3-year contract, and he says, yeah, sure, let's have a chat in a year. That's the biggest story in all of it. And Key's open enough to recognise that. But yeah, the cold, hard, tactical peculiarities, eccentricities of the last few weeks, that's the big on-field story that you can take from it, I think. And Buttler has appeared to be squiggly and confused, and you see it in his face. He's got a very expressive face. The 1,000-yard Buttler stare has come out in recent weeks. And Mott doesn't have the ability to communicate his own theories, certainly not to camera.
He's clearly not handled the press well out there, has he? And you can read between, obviously we're doing it all from here, but we can read between the lines from all the correspondents out there that they're not getting straight answers, and they're getting frustrated, and that's been reflected in a lot of the writing about him. My favourite bit of the Key interview was admission that they basically thought they could turn up and everything would be all right on the night, because that's so clearly the case, but it's actually quite a brave thing to acknowledge.
But he, yeah, it is. He also recognises, because he's a media man, he recognises when the time is right to hold your hands up and to deflect a little bit of the blame from his boys onto himself. And that point, self-evidently the case. And I think he intuitively understands that you need sometimes just to say these things in order just to kind of calm the fever around it all, because there will be that siege-like feeling now around the England team, and they go to the Caribbean in a couple of weeks or whatever it is, 3 or 4 weeks. And again, the press pack will be on their way. Key probably doesn't want to shake things up, right?
Especially with T20 World Cup just around the corner. What could you actually get right in that time? And also Buttler, if you want to sack him as captain, I mean, he's still, T20's hugely important player to the side. If he still wants that job, do you want to put his nose out of joint? He won the last one not so long ago.
Totally.
I think it's quite clear from everything he said as well that there is enough criticism in there of Buttler and Mott that if the next one doesn't work out, then they probably both go.
Well, he said, we move on. If it doesn't work out, we move on. Literal quote. The biggest result for Key in recent days will have been the conversation that he'd have had with Buttler. And we sort of spoke about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about the new squad and who should be captain. Clearly, Buttler has said, look, I've ballsed up here. Let me make it right. Let me repair the damage. And that would be a big relief for Key, because he doesn't want to have to upend the apple cart if he can help it. Mott is obviously he's a lesser figure in all of it. And when he was appointed at the time, the general consensus was, well, it's a sort of useful, like, bag carrier, middleman. You know, he's not going to expect any of the limelight. He's going to be fine to work in the slipstream of McCullum. He's not going to ask for too much. He's not going to put his foot down. He's going to be a useful figure in that overall hierarchy. Key doesn't want to tear that up if he can help it. And he certainly wouldn't have wanted to have picked a new captain, 7 or 8 months away from the next World Cup. And so that's a good result for him that Buttler is still utterly committed to it by the sounds of it, and he wants to make do, wants to make right.
I guess the proximity of both the West Indies tour and the World Cup really helps keeping them both in their jobs, because if they're going to make a change for the T20 World Cup, they really have to do it in the next couple of weeks before that West Indies tour, because there's really not that much cricket otherwise. I also wonder, looking longer term, that a big part of that white ball head coach role is standing up for making sure your players are available and you get your best players more often. Morgan did a slightly better job than Buttler and Mott have done in making sure he got his best players. Obviously, it's been particularly complicated at times over the last year, but I feel like there have been times, and we talked about it loads, but Joe Root not going to South Africa, for example, would McCullum have let that happen if McCullum was the coach in the year leading up to the World Cup? I don't know.
Well, sorry, Katya.
I should say, but that's the contrast, right? Like, you were talking about the contrast with Rob Key as a communicator to Jos Buttler. If you then think that Jos is also working in contrast to Stokes, running parallel with the men's side, who's such a good communicator purely through his confidence, his brazenness, and his body language in interviews. And then you look at Owen Morgan, who he's replaced, who's arguably the most effective communicator there's ever been in English cricket, and is also on the television, being really quite articulate and talking about the wrong stuff that Buttler's been doing. He's in a really tricky situation. He's got Rob Key and Morgan and Stokes and all these people who are really effective communicators that he's just not. And that doesn't necessarily mean he can't be a good captain, but it does mean that it's quite a glaring contrast to what's gone before. And I think that's gone into making his job quite a lot more difficult over the last few weeks. And it's also difficult to cut someone some slack when they're so different to what you are used to and have been used to over the last 6 years.
There are clear parallels between Buttler now as captain of the white ball sides and what Joe Root had to deal with at the end of his Test tenure. They're not hugely dissimilar characters in some ways as well. They don't shake things up necessarily. They're not going to kick up a fuss too much. It took a long time for Root to finally say enough was enough, and in India say, look, I haven't got my best team out there. And both of them had their captaincy criticised in some ways, fair enough, other ways for things that are out of their control to an extent. And I saw, when I've seen Buttler doing these quite sort of defensive press conferences, it does remind me of the back end of Root's tenure, where there was so much that was out of his control, and he obviously kind of almost wanted to say that, but you can't when you're England captain, because you've got to rise above it to a degree.
Jos Buttler's a very interesting person to talk to about cricket. He's a real thinker on the game. He has positioned himself over the years before the captaincy came around as a kind of an intellectual sort of agitator, if you like. And I remember he gave an interview to me here at the Oval a few years ago, and he says, if somebody says that's the way to do it, then I want to know why. And I want to challenge that conventional thinking all the time. And I guess the fuck it thing on the top of his bat indicated that there are a lot of internal thoughts percolating around in Jos Buttler. And perhaps the bat handle thing was a rebuttal of that. It was an attempt to try and sort of distill all of the thoughts in his mind, the theories around the game, into a sort of simplified approach. Just be liberated, just go and play. But if you have all of that natural compulsion, and then you're given the captaincy, and then, by the way, in brackets, you have all of this sort of political, diplomatic side of cricket these days as well. It is perhaps inevitable that the sort of clarity of conviction and thought, say, that Stokes obviously has and Morgan famously had, Morgan patented it, it's perhaps inevitable that Buttler might not be quite as laser focused and utterly committed to the bit as those two were beforehand, because that's not his persona.
And he found himself horribly out of form, which I don't think any of us anticipated. And that's not going to help your sense of conviction either.
Exactly that.
I always feel very sorry for England captains, full stop, because you're in charge because you're one of a handful of batters who is an automatic pick. And at times, there are very few of them. And then your job is so much more than being the person who makes on-field decisions. You have to, think about it with the women's side. Heather Knight, every time England play a game, is asked about questions that are broader than the events on the field from the last day. Josh Buttler has to have a coherent view on central contracts. Joe Root had to have a coherent view on bio bubbles. They have to deal with so much, and they're not given the roles because of any sort of expertise in that form of leadership. And some people rise to it, but others don't. And I don't think they should really be judged for that.
Yeah, but Buttler was earmarked for white ball captaincy for years and years and years before he took it up, right? And I think you can see a marked transition in cricket over the time that Buttler has almost been the heir to Morgan, to an almost anti-intellectual era, on field and off field, I guess. But if you look at Stokes and you look at McCullum and you look at others, it's so simple. It's so aggression, see ball, hit ball. We're going to play the way we play, that kind of stuff. So I wonder whether there's room for someone like Buttler, who's such a deep thinker and doesn't always have that complete conviction in everything he's doing. And I wonder whether that's developed.
Perhaps it's contrast, right? Perhaps if you had a coach who complemented that personality trait or set of traits, then perhaps that would work really nicely. But you don't get the sense with Mott that you may be just speculating wildly, but you don't get the feeling with Mott that he's not a great orator. We've seen that. And you don't get the feeling that he's a particularly strong figure that Buttler can lean on, scrap with in a positive way, constructively argue with. Seems like there's been a sort of like a flatness of thinking because there's been so much overthinking, right? There's a lack of conviction. And as Key says, the consequence of that is that you lose your identity.
It's still strange that's happened in a dressing room with Ben Stokes and Mo and Ali. Almost whatever Matthew Mott's doing, you'd think they would. I just find that very odd.
I agree. I thought that all woke up.
Yeah, for sure.
They've all acknowledged it as well, haven't they?
Yeah.
But then maybe there's a delicacy there with Stokes now as Test captain, that he doesn't want to overstep and he doesn't want to impose his own brand and image, because that brand is so powerful, that Ben Stokes image. And he knows it's Buttler's team and he doesn't want to impose too much onto that. And he also doesn't know, I don't think, what part of ODI cricket he's going to have going forward. He said on Sky at the end of the game he doesn't know.
That's it.
So, I think there's quite a lot of tension in there.
About
there you go.
Not so long ago as well. Yeah, it's difficult to come back in. I mean, this is the way we're going to play, lads. Sorry, I haven't been around for the last little while.
Yeah, so maybe there's a kind of dancing around each other and pussyfooting around it of people not really saying what they think, not because they're afraid to, but because they don't want to impose on others. And when you've got Josh Buttler, he's not a particularly imposing guy, that just kind of leads to a stagnation in productive conversations.
Yeah. And I don't think you can discount the psychology of Stokes being there. Sure, committed, of course he is. Committed with everything he does. But nonetheless, still knowing in his heart of hearts he's not going to play white ball cricket again after this for England. That interview was a sort of an indication of that without saying it. And obviously he didn't play for a year and a half or whatever it was in the build-up to it. And you can't shake that sort of psychological element of it either, I don't think. Just very, very briefly, Jofra Buttler. Very, very briefly, Monday morning. He'd be a handy
cricketer, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Very briefly on a Monday morning. Jofra Archer, not Jofra Buttler. More pain in his elbow, right? Key said it himself. So they're now not going to consider selecting him for anything, even a support squad, until he's 100% ready. If he's complaining of more problems, more pain in the elbow, that's heart-rending stuff. And again, we'll just leave that there. But that's what Key's been telling us. Take a bet with Jofra because of the upside, but now we're going to have to wait again.
Yeah.
Maybe forever.
Big day, of course, for ILT20 fan David Cameron back in as Foreign Secretary. Got me thinking, what's the cricketing equivalent of that comeback? Video editor Dan suggested it had similar vibes to Stokes' text to Moeen at the start of the Ashes. Foreign Secretary ? Lol.
Definitely similar vibes there.
But did his ILT20 appearance get him the gig as Foreign Secretary? He's clearly got great relations.
I've got a good one for you.
Yeah,
actually, it's back to the Gooch Gower era. Obviously, Gooch came in as a sort of rather kind of straight line sergeant major like skipper, trying to get order back into the chaos of the Gower era, got rid of Gower as a consequence, and Gower became this sort of symbol of a more sort of laissez-faire approach to life. Gooch came in, sharpened everything up, and then England kept getting beat. And so what does he do? He turns to his old bête noire and he says, David, do you mind if you can come back and strum a few through the covers for us? And thus he did. Of course, the end point of that is that they both collapsed in a heap and resulted in many years of flux and failure.
Well, we can only hope, can't we?
We talked earlier about the comparison between Sachin and the Queen. In my head, Strauss and Cameron sort of operate in a similar field in my head as authority figures from the early 2010s. And I guess Strauss does come back whenever something goes seriously wrong. So similarities there.
They look quite similar.
Yeah. They do, I guess. I do.
I mean, we can see Strauss in the shadow cabinet in three years' time, can't we?
He could be there by the time this pod comes out. Anyway, moving on. We have some squad news for England and their tour to India. They play 3 T20s and a test match all in Mumbai. Sophie Ecclestone is back after her shoulder injury. Bess Heath is in both squads. It's England's first test in India since 2005, so there's not a lot of recent form to go on. Katya, what caught your eye from those squads? I mean, for me, Tammy Beaumont still not being back in the T20 group was interesting, given her form in the summer.
Yeah, I guess it was expected, if still interesting. I mean, she hasn't. What she did over the summer was enough, or perhaps should have been enough to get her back in the T20 squad, and then there's been no cricket since that Sri Lanka series. So if that wasn't enough to get her back in, then she hasn't had an opportunity to do more to get herself back in. It still doesn't make sense to me how you can have someone in that much form and not have them as part of your T20 squad. But if you're looking purely at the test squad, I guess you can also say Izzy Wong as well. They finally said, no, we're going to have her in the development squad only. We're not going to bring her along in the main squads. And I think Bess Heath is also interesting because while you'd expect her to be there as a backup keeper, Amy Jones's record over the summer internationally was not great. And our record over the past few years has also been troubling. So I think there are signs that they're looking to kind of line up Heath as a replacement to her and taking her on such a tour with such limited multi-day experience for her is potentially interesting. I also think Alice Capsey for the test squad is pretty interesting because of the overs she was entrusted with the ball over the summer in the limited overs Ashes series. And obviously being in India, you're going to expect the pitches to turn. So if they can find a way of getting her in as an almost like second and a half or third spin option alongside Dean and Ecclestone, if Ecclestone's shoulder allows, then that would be a pretty good spin attack, you've got to think. So yeah, I think there were some interesting calls, but not necessarily unexpected ones, if that makes sense.
No, I'm with you.
Could I just say, Sarah Glenn not in the test squad? I know, if she bowls, she's a sort of white ball specialist and all that, but if you ever are going to see how she goes in a test match, then you would think it would be out there where the ball is actually going to turn. You'd feel like she would be easily neutered on pitches out here in England, but out there it might have been an interesting option. As it is, they've now got three, obviously 2 off-break bowlers and Ecclestone. I guess they wouldn't want to play more than 2, I suppose.
I think Dean and Ecclestone have been their test spinners that they've gone to for a number of years now, and there's not going to be much that's going to upset that.
Yeah.
And they like Capsey, and they want to find a way of getting Capsey into the side, and maybe this is the perfect environment to bring Capsey into the test side. As for who she could come in for, you've got to think it will be 2 of Dunkley, Wyatt and Capsey. And in the middle order and see how they go. The other one is Emma Lamb as well. Like, she burst onto the scene but has had a quiet time over the last 18 months or so. So yeah, I mean, maybe this is a kind of like do or bust one, but we'll have to see.
Could you tell me a bit more about Bess Heath, because Amy Jones has been hanging in there in truth for a while, and she remains quite an enigmatic cricketer, really. I haven't seen really much of Bess Heath at all. Is she a legitimate replacement, do you think? Do you think they might actually take the plunge?
Yeah, I'd say Amy Jones probably has the potential to offer a bit more with the bat than Bess Heath does. He's a brilliant keeper. She played a couple of really good innings as a lower order hitter in the 100. So she's kind of that John Lewis mould. He always talks about positivity and aggression, and that's Bess Heath. She's that kind of player. And that's not what we've seen from Amy Jones over the last few years, especially in Test cricket. She's been quite stagnant, I think is probably the right word. She hasn't come in and really taken an innings by the balls and got it moving. And I think that's what John Lewis wants to implement. We saw that when he put Wyatt into the Test squad after how many years of her career. So I think Bess Heath could be interesting, even if it's not quite yet. She's going to be put into the 11.
So I've just been looking at her recent. So she's playing out for the Heat in the WBBL, and she's batting very low down in that order, batting sort of 9 and 10. Which suggests that she's a keeper who bats at the moment.
But does properly whack it.
She does whack it.
She's top of. I think she was top of the strike rate lists in the 100 over the summer.
Right.
Yeah. And they've got plenty of like bowling all rounders who bat as well. So it's not like they'd be elongating the tail too much by including her, especially if you've then got Capsy in as well, and you know Sophie Eccleston's back. So yeah, I don't think there's an issue with compromising the batting with her. She would just be a different role than Amy Jones.
And no Georgia Adams in anything. Which, you know, she won literally everything she could last year and took loads of wickets and scored loads of runs. It looks like John Lewis has just decided she's not the sort of cricketer that fits the mould that he has prescribed. But she's only 30. I mean, it's not... just when you're talking about Emma Lamb there, the fact that Emma Lamb gets picked ahead of Georgia Adams on the face of it doesn't make a huge amount of sense, apart from there is that she is a bit younger and is perhaps a bit more of a dynamic player. But
yeah, I think what Lewis has shown us over the last year, and I think there's a tendency as well with England women's coaches to do, is have quite a rigid thought process in terms of selection. And there's almost a catching up of mindset to be done with this depth of players that England now have and the pool you can select from. And at the same time, acknowledging that they don't play cricket enough. So to just throw a bunch of new people in there is an incredibly risky thing to do. So I think there's a lot of stuff that he's having to balance in his own head. And equally, if there's going to be more international cricket played over the next few years for the women, then maybe he does want to keep the youngsters in and make that happen. You can also see that in the A squad they've selected. That's an incredibly young squad with a lot of under-19 stars in it. So I think it's more of a moving forward thing rather than a players who might have got an opportunity earlier and perhaps should have done, but you know, that kind of stuff.
Meg Lanning announced her retirement from international cricket towards the end of last week at the age of 31. An astonishing career, really, the figurehead of one of the most dominant sides in the sport's history. I mean, Jo, she leaves a legacy that very few can match.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the team that she's led, the best team women's game's ever seen, and you could argue that she's the best female batter the game's ever seen as well.
No doubt.
Yeah.
I just can't see past her. Just for the purity of the technique as well. As
I was just thinking...
monstrous amount of runs that she's accrued.
Statistically, I mean, Charlotte Edwards would have to be in the conversation as well. But, you know, Lanning's the more talented stroke maker, I think.
She's the more complete batter for me. There was a Cricket Australia compilation that they put out after the announcement, and just the purity of the shot making is right up there. There's no quirks in any of it, and there was in Charlotte's game. She was obviously a machine, but there was in Charlotte's game. There are as well in Natalie's game as well, and Nat Sivabrunt's game. There are certain kind of technical quirks, whereas Lanning, she's just a pure player, unbelievable player, really.
Do you think she's also occupies quite an enigmatic position in that she never gives anything much away at all? Remember, you interviewed Heather Knight about captaining against Meg Lanning and said you just don't get anything out of her at all. I mean, it's that kind of...
Well, she took to making jokes, pre-planning jokes ahead of the toss, thinking, right, one's got to land eventually. I've got to break this shield, this force field around Lanning. Never, nowhere near. You know, she's just like this impermeable force field, really, in the game. But and yet she showed real emotion when she announced her retirement. You know,
well, and also the vulnerability of taking a break from the game. What was she out of the game for?
Quite a while, quite a few months, nearly
almost a year. And that came after 2 World Cups and a Commonwealth Games. I mean, the schedule had been pretty relentless. But I think, in my mind, there was a bit of surprise that Lanning wrongly, obviously, but a bit surprised that she did take that break because she just seemed so machine-like, really. But I remember she took a break from the game and was working in a coffee shop and sort of took herself away, came back, was brilliant again. And, you know, that she could have played for several more years, but has obviously, you know, had enough of the stresses and strains of the job.
Yeah, I mean, she achieved pretty much everything there is to achieve in the game, right, at an exceptionally young age. What was it, Australia captain, age of 21, you know, Commonwealth Games, T20 World Cup, multiple, you know, ODI World Cup in 2022, having already won it, but not as captain in 2013. I don't even know how you then get yourself up to achieve more. And maybe her greatest achievement will be the legacy that she leaves for the next generation of Australia players, because they've had this team that's so unbeatable over the last few years. If they carry that on, that almost says more about Meg Lanning than her achievements ever had, because she's created this breeding ground for success that's so difficult to create and, you know, let alone sustain. So regardless of the medals, I think that is her ultimate legacy in the game for Australia, you know.
There's another additional element to that the men's players in Australia revere her. And it's not just a cute thing to say when you talk about the most complete technical players in Australian cricket, when they often reference Meg Lanning. And another element of that legacy is that she has taken the respect that women's cricket garners to a different level because of her brilliance, because of her complete technical brilliance. And just from a personal point of view, the 100 I think I might have mentioned this on this show before.
Chelmsford?
The Chelmsford 100, sorry if I've mentioned it before, but I went with
it's all good.
with a friend, and we went with their two girls who were just getting into cricket, and I think one would have been about 13 at the time, one would have been 10 or 11, and they were just learning about the game, and they were mesmerised by her because she was so obviously this sort of shimmering figure doing it differently to everybody else. And obviously it was her day as well, right? She smashed 100, but there was just this sort of like light around her, this glow around her. And obviously I was hamming it up massively watching with the girls, but they were totally mesmerised by it. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget seeing that sort of transference of love from the genius that's doing it to the kids that are ready for it, you know. And it was quite a special night to watch that, really.
I think you almost see that aura more in the absence of it as well, because you saw the Australia team come over this summer, and while they retained the Ashes, they were not as good as they have been over the last few years. And Alyssa Healy leading them, brilliant player, absolutely incredible player, but she's so different to Lanning, you know. And in press conference, she was a lot more open and a lot more kind of brazen, I guess, than Lanning was, rather than humble. And that's Alyssa Healy's aura, and that's fine. But it's not what we've been used to from an Australia side, who are quietly confident. There was never a question of whether they should be confident. It was always, no, just we are confident. And that's Meg Lanning. And when you took that away, there was something missing. The performance was there and the players were there, but there was still something missing. And how they recreate that or create something new from that, I guess, is their next challenge of this era that they've created, and a testament to the impact that Lanning has.
Well, it's reeling off some of the stats around Lanning. 1,500s in ODI cricket, the most in the women's game, second most runs in women's T20Is, and as it's been alluded to already, a 7-time world champion across formats and a Commonwealth gold winner as well, all done at the age of 31.
Yeah, well back.
Which is quite something. One of the biggest stories in the world game this week is that Sri Lanka have been suspended as members of the ICC. With immediate effect because of extensive government interference in the board's administration. I spoke to Estelle Vasudevan, who we've heard from on the dailies over the World Cup, about the news and the background around it. It's maybe the biggest cricket story in the week. Sri Lanka have been suspended by the ICC, 1996 World Cup winners, a team that we, in the recent past at least, are used to seeing at the final stages of major tournaments. Estelle, this is a massive story. Did it come as much of a surprise to you in Sri Lanka?
I don't think you can say that it came as a surprise, because there was kind of that week of build-up where after Sri Lanka's loss to India in the World Cup, there were a lot of rumblings, and then the sports minister decided to appoint an interim committee led by Arjuna Ranatunga to kind of take over SLC and look into what was going on within the board. And then, of course, that was overturned by the courts. And then the president of the country got involved. So there was a lot of things going on within the country. So I don't think you can say that it came as a surprise, but it's certainly unwelcome news as a Sri Lankan fan, especially with, the Under-19 World Cup to come in Sri Lanka early 2024.
So the ICC bans government interference, and people have made the accusation that they're not necessarily consistent in the application of that rule. From your point of view, has there been government interference? And if so, is it a negative interference?
There is no way that you avoid government interference in Sri Lanka, because every board has to be ratified by the sports ministry, right? That's how the sports law in the country works. So even if, for example, the World Cup squad, it is decided by the selectors and then it is sent to the sports ministry, where the sports minister has to put his stamp on it.
And that's been the case for a long time. That's nothing.
Yes.
That's nothing new.
Yes. Yeah. That's nothing new. So that's by definition, that is government interference, right? There's no way that you can say at any point, at least in the last 20, 30 years, that the Sri Lankan board has been devoid of government interference. But there has been, in the last couple of years, as at least with the appointment of Roshan Ranasinghe as a sports minister, some efforts to kind of look into how the funds are used by Sri Lanka Cricket. And there have been lots of allegations of corruption. So there's been kind of that push consistently over the last couple of years. But like you mentioned, I mean, it doesn't seem like ICC do, look at it the same way in every country, because in that case, I don't think any South Asian team, there's no South Asian team at the moment, whether it's India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, that doesn't have some kind of political interference in the running of the cricket board.
So has the interference become greater recently? And two, there are reports that the Sri Lanka Cricket Board themselves actually went to the ICC and alerted them of the extent of the interference, almost to sort of solve what is becoming, in their view, a greater problem. Is that fair? I
can't say for certain, but you could imagine that being the reality, because in the past, although there's been interference, generally the board and the sports minister have kind of got along, because they have common interests in, keeping Sri Lanka within the ICC. And, in the past as well, I remember in 2014 or 15, when there was an interim committee appointed, I believe ICC withheld funds from the country. So they don't want that to happen. So that's always kind of the threat, right? When there is when they feel like there's excessive involvement, that's always put out there, look, we could be banned. And if we're banned, we lose out on this amount of funds. We can't run any domestic cricket, and although even this suspension, we don't know how long it'll last. But even if it is 1 month, that does have kind of a ripple effect on the lower ranks of cricket being played in the country, with domestic tournaments, and, infrastructure and things like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if the board themselves went to ICC as a way of kind of almost sending a warning to the government or whoever is trying to, get in the business of the SLC, to say, look, that there could be serious consequences to interference. Although in the past, when there's been kind of that political element, there hasn't been a ban. There could be, serious consequences to come.
So ultimately, do you think that financial threat will mean that the house is put in order, as it were? I remember that, I guess the most similar case to this is Zimbabwe. A few years ago, Zimbabwe were suspended for the ICC for a period of time, and I think might have missed out on a T20 World Cup as a result, or at least missed one qualifying campaign result. So do you see that actually this threat will deter the current level of interference? And if so, do you think it'll happen quite quickly? Because the thing hanging over this is that Sri Lanka are supposed to be hosting a Under-19 World Cup in 2 months' time. So that's really not that long for major logistical changes to be had.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because even within the government, there seems to be kind of a divide in that when the sports minister initially appointed the interim committee, the president's press unit came out with a statement saying that they hadn't heard of it until it was out in the media, and that then they had a cabinet meeting and decided to appoint a 4-member committee to oversee SLC, right? But the sports minister was not very happy with that. And from his point of view, according to sports law in the country, he does have the authority to disband the office bearers at SLC and appoint an interim committee. So at the moment, that's where I think there is kind of a difference of opinion, where I think the president of the country and that faction would very much want to, pull back and allow the appointed board members to carry on with their work, at least for the time being, so that we can go on with, like you mentioned, the under-19 World Cup. And, even a couple of days or a week can make a huge difference in that, in the preparation, right? Because I know that in Colombo, some of the grounds that are going to be used, renovations are taking place in the pavilions and things like that. So that's even a week can make a huge difference. But also the sports minister has come out and said that he is going to speak to the ICC, and there is a kind of a pathway to consult with the ICC and see what needs to be done from Sri Lanka's part to get this suspension lifted. But if they are unable to, come to a satisfactory resolution, he is willing to go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which could really, that could have serious consequences depending on how the ICC takes it. Because like we spoke about already, like if you look at how the ICC is dealing with political interference, it does not seem like they really give too much. They're too concerned with political interference itself, but how it affects commercial interests, right? So if the minister does follow through on that, then I think there might be, serious consequences for Sri Lanka cricket, and we might see, an extended period where Sri Lanka is not in international cricket. I don't think the hosting of the tournament will be affected in that it's 2 months away, and it doesn't, logically, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense to kind of shift locations now. So it will probably go ahead in Sri Lanka, but like you mentioned about Zimbabwe, participation might be the main issue to focus on.
I guess finally, most of our listeners are in the UK, and cricket fans in the UK will probably say there's not enough government interference in cricket. They don't really care what's going on. Why is it in Sri Lanka that there's a desire for the government and certain ministers to get more involved than they have been before? Is it just a care thing? Do they just want the team to be doing better? What is the reason why there is potentially more interference at the moment than before?
In my opinion, there's more interest because there's so much money in it, right? Sri Lanka is going through, I'm sure your listeners would have heard about the difficulties Sri Lanka is going through economically. There are so many, more important issues to deal with in the country. But suddenly cricket is being discussed in the parliament. You're having cabinet meetings discuss, the corruption. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be dealt with. If there's corruption, obviously it should be dealt with. But it does not seem, at least to me, like it's a genuine attempt to, weed out the corruption, but rather kind of get a piece of the pie in cricket, because it is kind of, financially, it's a very rich area in Sri Lanka. So yeah, it doesn't seem genuine to me. But if you're being really optimistic, you would think that if the minister has his way, he would be able to at least clean out the house to a certain degree.
Well, thanks a lot for your time, Estelle. It's a complicated issue, and I'm sure it's one that will remain in the news for the months ahead. Fingers crossed that it all sorts itself out. Sri Lanka's suspension naturally led to questions about other countries who have not been suspended by the ICC. Afghanistan are the obvious one in that they do not have a women's team, something that's in the ICC stipulations for what a full member has to do. Katya, this is a very, very complicated story. I don't really know what I think about it, but something we've talked about in the office, something that I think we felt is that there've been a lot of opinions around it, but not so much actually from women from Afghanistan telling the story of what's gone on, and specifically cricketers from Afghanistan telling the story. And you spoke to Feroza Afghan, who was awarded a central contract with Afghanistan a couple of years ago. Before we hear from her and her story, can you sum up what has happened to her over the last few years?
Yeah, so I first spoke to Feroza back in, I think it was April of this year, and she told me her story of what happened to her and her love of cricket, really. That's one of the first things you get from Feroza, is she absolutely loves cricket. And as a teenager, she was one of the first tranche of women in Afghanistan who were awarded central contracts in late 2020. And while the conditions for them to be a national team in that environment weren't anywhere near you would expect them to be, there was a pathway going forward. She was in school, she was doing exams, and then a few months later in 2021, the Taliban came back to power and she suddenly found herself in quite a lot of danger, and that ended in her having to flee over the border with her family, her siblings and her mother and her aunt into Pakistan. And there were all sorts of terrible situations that led to that. She was at one point cornered in the street by Taliban fighters who were demanding to know who she was. They had to burn all their bats and their balls in case the Taliban found them and discovered who they were. And there was a very real possibility that the Taliban would kill her if they knew who she was. And they reached out in that situation to the ACB and to others for help and found their numbers blocked and irresponsive to them. So there was a very real fear of what happens next. Feroza and her family didn't have passports at the time, so there was complications for them getting to Pakistan, which ended in them crossing the border illegally into Pakistan and then spending 9 months in a refugee camp in Pakistan while they tried to get to Australia. And she was the last player of the 22 in Australia to arrive. She arrived in, I think, early 2022, and has set about building a new life for herself in Australia, all the time making sure that she keeps telling the stories of what happened to her and her teammates, and keeps fighting for what she wants more than anything, which is to be able to represent Afghanistan again and to play cricket again. I believe she's playing for 4 different cricket clubs in Melbourne.
Can I just, so the 22 female players who were given national contracts are all in Australia?
I don't know whether they all are, but there are 22 players in Australia. I think there might be a couple in Canada, but there are definitely 22 in Australia.
Right. And in this chat that we're about to play, is there a discussion about the possibility, however remote, that there can be some kind of, if you like, auxiliary organised setup in Australia? That's in exile, in effect?
That's what Feroza and a number of the other players want. They want to be able to represent Afghanistan in Australia. They know there is zero possibility in Afghanistan where women aren't allowed to be educated or hold jobs of playing cricket. And they have written to the ICC to ask about the funding that the women's team was granted back in 2021 and where that funding has gone and whether they could have access to it as the players.
And what's been the response from them? The
response has been no direct response to the team, which Feroza is pretty unhappy about, as you can imagine. They released a general statement saying that the ICC were unwilling to punish the men's team, which I think would involve funding being directed towards the women's team in exile, because the ACB are operating within the laws of their country, which presumably allow women and teenagers to be chased over the borders. So that was the ICC's response. Feroza's...
The ACB is also in receipt of money from the Taliban as well, as confirmed by their CEO in a BBC story from a few days back. They were facing financial straits. The Taliban gave them $1.2 million.
Yeah.
Which is not insignificant, right?
No, not at all. But the biggest thing that I got from Feroza's interview is that they do not want the men's team to be banned. And their voices are the most, or should be, the most central in this conversation. And they reached out to the ICC and they asked them for help. That's primarily what they asked them for. And the ICC has pretty much ignored them and said no. They haven't ignored the situation, but they've ignored these players and haven't responded to them. And in such unimaginable situation that they faced themselves in, I think we'd all like to think if we found ourselves in such a situation, if we asked for help, we'd be acknowledged. And that's not what's happened to them.
So one important bit of information that we don't hear from Feroza and gives a bit of context around her view of what should happen to the men's team is actually one of the groups that they did ask for help from was the men's team, and they didn't find a lot of practical support from them.
Yeah. So when the T20 World Cup was happening in Australia, Feroza told me a few months ago that she went to talk to some of the men's players who she said she knew of or had contact with in Afghanistan to ask for their help, not just in supporting women in Afghanistan, but specifically in supporting the team and the team's rights to play cricket. And she said that she went to Rashid Khan's hotel, and the direct quote from her is, "They don't want to talk about us. We support our men's team and we go to matches, but now it's time they support us too." One day in Melbourne during the World Cup, I went to the hotel where the players were staying. I saw Rashid Khan there and I went to speak with him and asked him why he didn't support us now. He was silent and didn't say anything. I asked him to please support us. If you support us, maybe the ICC would allow us to play cricket here for Afghanistan. He was silent and then he said to me, "I try my best." She also acknowledges in the interview that we did a couple of days ago that there are complexities for the Afghanistan men's players. We don't know how many of them have family in Afghanistan and what pressure they might be under from the Taliban government. But I think she's exceedingly angry that they're not getting the support that they have asked for from the groups that they have asked for support from. And that's primarily her stance on it.
Well, it's an extraordinarily complicated story in some ways, but very simple in others. Here is the conversation between Katya and Feroza.
How many of your teammates are currently in Australia?
I think 22. I'm not sure about that, but I think 22. They are 22.
Amazing. And they all came through Pakistan as well, is that right?
Yeah. All of my teammates, they went to Pakistan first and they came to Australia.
Okay. And were you one of the last ones to get to Australia or one of the first ones?
I was the last player to come to Australia.
What was that like when you saw your teammates again when you got to Australia?
When I was in Pakistan, they told me about the cricket here and they enjoyed the life and cricket. And I was like that. I wish it to come to Australia soon. And yeah.
And do you still train with your teammates?
Some of my teammates, they play for different clubs and I play for different clubs. And yeah. But in Tuesday competition, we play together.
Nice. And is that as Afghanistan?
It's not the Afghanistan team, but I and some of my teammates, they play with together in one team.
And are you still hopeful of being able to represent Afghanistan as a women's team?
Yeah, sure. This is my biggest dream, to have here represent for Afghanistan and have our team.
And I know you wrote to the ICC about 9 months ago. Could you tell me what that letter said?
Unfortunately, we didn't receive any news, any update from them. And they still ignore us about the Afghanistan women's team. And they don't want to talk to us about a Afghanistan women's player. I don't know why, but it's happened.
And how does that make you feel?
For sure, it's too bad. And we feel too bad, and we just want to play here for Afghanistan women's team because it's our right to play for our country. And now girls and women, they can play for Afghanistan in Afghanistan, and we just want to have team and make our team here and represent for Afghanistan people and women.
There was an interview with the ICC chief executive yesterday. And he said that the ICC are helping the Afghanistan Cricket Board, operate within the laws of their country, which means women can't play cricket. What would your response be to they are simply allowing the ACB to operate within the laws of the country?
I think ICC told us they want the Afghanistan team in Afghanistan, but how it's possible when in Afghanistan women can work, can study, can even go to school, and how it's possible women come and play cricket in Afghanistan. And I don't think so it's happened.
What would you say to people who say that the Afghanistan men's team should not be allowed to play because of the situation for women in their country?
I think we don't want the men's team banded and they can't play. We don't want that. We just want we have our rights to play, because they are also player and we are also player, and they are also wants to play for Afghanistan, represent Afghanistan and Afghanistan people, and we also want that, and we just need their support, and we just need they come and talk about us, about our rights, and we just want that. We don't want anyone get the right to can't play, and that's too bad for a player. They can't play, and we just want right, and we just want their support to be voice and
Do you feel like you're getting that support from them?
we didn't receive any support from them, and they didn't want to talk about us, and that is so feeling bad.
Why do you think they didn't want to talk about you or support you?
I just think the poor situation, because some of them they live in Afghanistan, and they just scared, I think, the Taliban governments and maybe like this.
Obviously, Afghanistan have been doing so well in the World Cup at the minute. I've been watching them on the screen now. They're doing very well.
Play right now.
How does that make you feel? What emotions does that stir up in you?
If I be honest, I'm so happy for them, because they made history. They have so couples amazing win. They did it amazing, and I just wish when I see them I watch their play and their matches. I wish it's also happened for women's team as well, because this is our biggest dream, and I'm still hope for that. And every time I watch their matches, I just think about our women's team. That one day we also can play for Afghanistan in World Cup.
That would be amazing. I think you've kind of answered my next question, but if you have one hope for the Afghanistan women's team going forward, what would that be?
The Afghanistan women's team made, and they allowed to play for Afghanistan, represent the women's in Afghanistan, because we born in war, and we growing with war, and we have bad situation in Afghanistan, but just we want to show the world and the other women's the Afghanistan women, how they are strong, how they are amazing, how they have good talent, and
And if there's one thing that the ICC or the international community could do to help that happen, what would that be?
I just want to tell them, please don't ignore us. We have this right to play for our country, because in every program and every competition, ICC told the all fan cricket, everyone can play cricket everywhere. So we just want our rights to play for our country, and they should give us our rights.
So if one day you were walking out in a stadium with the Afghanistan badge on your shirt and a bat or a ball in your hand, how would that make you feel?
This is my biggest dream, to have my uniform, my Afghanistan uniform, and I still fight for that, to have that, and for sure I have feel too good. That time I think I have everything. If I have my uniform, my Afghanistan woman's uniform, I have everything.
Finally, on today's show, we've talked a little bit before about the possibility of traveling to India, if that's something you want to do. Earlier this week, Ben spoke to someone from Gulliver's Travel to hear about all the opportunities they have in store for you if you want to go to India in early 2024.
So I'm delighted to have joining us Callum Wardlaw, part of the Gulliver's team. First of all, Callum, just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about you and what's your role at Gulliver's, and how long have you sort of been involved with the team there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. So my name's Callum. I've been working at Gulliver's just over 2 years now. Absolutely love working there. I'm part of the commercial team, so So our role is sourcing quotes from suppliers, negotiating with them, and then we create and build all of the products. We then load them into the system, build them on the website, and then once they're live on the website and bookable, our role is to kind of manage the stock there.
Cool, nice. There's a lot of, or at least there's a few sort of cricket touring travel companies. What is it that sets Gulliver's apart from the rest of the herd?
Yeah, so I mean, Gulliver's have been running tours to these cricket destinations for over 50 years now, and so the wealth of experience that they've got, both in the office as well as the tour managers that travel in resort with you as well, is amazing. And to me, there's nothing more enjoyable than a Gulliver's tour where you're traveling around with like-minded people, watching England play this absurd sport, with everything taken care of for you. So yeah, I think that's what sets them apart, is just the wealth of experience and travel knowledge that they've got.
Yeah, nice. So you do get to travel around with the tour groups, and it's not all just sitting in an office on the phone and stuff. What's your favourite memory from a Gulliver's tour that you've been on?
Yeah, no, so we get to travel as well with the groups. So in the last 2 years, I've done a test match in Barbados, T20 World Cup in Australia, which was good to actually see England win a few games. And I've just got back from the World Cup in India too. So there may be a little bit of recency bias here, but my favourite memory is probably, so the back end of the tour I've just done in India, we had a group dinner arranged in Jaipur while we were doing some sightseeing. So it was on top of the rooftop in the Amber Fort in Jaipur, and we had basically the place to ourselves. The whole group was there enjoying traditional Indian food. There was Rajasthani music playing in the background. The ambience and the setting was just amazing. So yeah, just a really lovely evening. So it's not all about the cricket on our tours. Even when England are losing, we still have a good time.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've been for Barbados, if that was for the Test match, and then for this World Cup, you've probably not seen a whole lot of England winning. But hopefully that'll change soon.
Yeah, Barbados, terrible game, boring draw. This one, our tour saw England lose 4 times, so it was nice to go to Australia and see us win a few games.
What types of tours have Gulliver's got coming up? Hopefully, where you see England win a few.
Yeah. So the big one for us is the Test series in India at the start of next year. So back end of January through to March, I think. So there's 5 tests. I've actually been to three of the venues myself: Hyderabad, Vizag, Dharamsala. So I'm pretty sure it's going to be a really good series. Be interesting to see how Bazball gets on in India against Ashwin, Jadeja, Axar Patel. Definitely going to be the most stern test they faced so far, I think. But we've got a range of tours going. So first test, second test, third test, and fifth test, or any combination of multi-test tours. Some of the trips include an extension to the Golden Triangle, which is pretty incredible. So for some of them, it's before the cricket. Sometimes it's after. Sometimes it's in between test matches. So we've got a wide range of products. There's also the option to book international flights with us or arrange your own travel. So we're pretty flexible there. And if you wanted to amend the tours slightly at all, yeah, we're quite flexible with that too.
Cool, that does genuinely sound amazing. And yeah, hopefully, as you say, England put up a good showing. If I were to book, how would I book, or how would I speak to someone to learn more, or what's the best place to go?
Yeah, so on our website, gulliverstravel.co.uk, is all the tours are listed online. And if you see one that you like the look of, we've got a really friendly sales team who are really knowledgeable about all of the products. So the best way to contact them would either be to phone 01684 879 560 or to email sales@gulliverstravel.co.uk.
Cool, nice. And all that information will be in the blurb of the podcast as well. So if you didn't catch that, you can just go there and email or go online. Cheers, Callum. It's been great chatting to you. And
lovely. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, hopefully you get to see a good series out there at the start of next year.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
That is everything for today. A very long show. Thanks, Katya. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Joe. This has been the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast. We'll be back on Wednesday after that first semi-final.